Hello and welcome to the DFW Divorce Insider Podcast, answering all of the questions you didn't know you had about family law. I'm your host, Matthew Eitzen, and for our 6th episode, we are going to be discussing prenups, postnups, and cohabitation agreements. Our guest today is actually our first returning guest, Duffy and Eitzen name partner, who also happens to be my mother, Melinda Eitzen. How are you doing, Mom?
I'm great. I'm glad to be here.
Good, good. We're very glad to have you here. So, as I said just a second ago, our topic today is prenups, postnups, and cohabitation agreements. And I should clarify, for anyone who isn't aware, that prenup and postnup stands for prenuptial and postnuptial agreements, is what's being left off of the end there. Cohabitation agreement is a little more self-explanatory. So I thought it would be good to start with prenup, since that's the first thing in the title. So why don't we start from a very simple place? And Mom, can you just tell us, what is a prenup?
Yes, and before I tell you that, I think this is timely because I've noticed with COVID that a lot of people are delaying their weddings, and maybe they meant to get a prenup and they just couldn't get it done in time, and now they have a little more time. So it's a good time to consider it if they didn't already get it done. So what is a prenuptial agreement? Prenuptial agreement is a contract, and it allows people to change what would happen to their property at divorce or death from what would normally happen under the law if they were to divorce or die without this contract. And there's different reasons people might want one.
Which leads me nicely into my next question. Why might someone want a prenup?
Okay, so I'll give you some examples. Sometimes people don't like what the law would do, and most people don't even know. So this is just good to get educated about what would happen without one.
Yeah, let's start with that. I think that's
so if you don't have a prenup in Texas and you get divorced, let's talk about divorce because it's a little bit different with death, and we'll focus on divorce for today. The court divides your community property in a fair and just manner. And community property is anything you've acquired while you were married, with the exception of inheritance or gift. And the other exception is something you owned prior to your marriage that still exists and that you can trace from that ownership to today. So let's start with that exception and example. So under the law, without a prenup, if I had worked at a job and had built up a 401k before I got married, and then 20 years later I got divorced, the original monies that I earned in that 401k up to the day I got married are separate property. And they're not in the pot to be divided. I get them. The problem with not having a prenup is, without a prenup, I have to go get documents from 20 years ago all the way to today to show that that money was pre-marriage money and that it still exists. Well, a lot of institutions don't keep documents that old, and I don't keep them in my attic. I shred them. So I probably can't prove it. So I've just lost that claim. So one reason that people get a prenup is it's not that they're trying to change the law. They just don't want to have that burden of proof to go back 20 years. They want to say in the prenup, hey, I have a 401k and I'm identifying it now. And if I get divorced, that 401k is my separate property. Another common reason, you still carrying forward the 401k example, is without a prenuptial agreement, the growth of that asset, for example, let's say that my 401k is invested in stocks and they pay dividends. That dividend payment is a community property asset. So now my 401k got all mixed up, right? Because even though I didn't put another dollar of earnings in it, let's say I'd already left that job when I got married, all those dividend payments have become community. So now it's a big mess of community and separate. Well, a lot of people think if my 401k grew just because of market conditions or because of my dividend payments, that should still be mine. And you can do that with a prenup. You can say, look, any growth of your separate property, the property you had prior to marriage, or the property you received during marriage by inheritance should just be mine, and any growth of yours should just be yours. And they can achieve that through a prenup.
So, are there any limitations on what people can do with a prenup? That is to say, if I wanted to get a prenup saying, if we get divorced, I want my motorcycle to be set on fire. Is that a thing we could do?
Well, that's a unusual example.
I don't know why I would want that, but if I did.
Anything that they can contract to under the law is allowed, but there are a couple of things that come up often, not the motorcycle example exactly, but a couple of things that come up that you cannot contract for because it's against public policy. One example would be if they have children or anticipate having children in the future, you cannot in a prenup say what will happen with the custody of your children. And that's for the reason that we need to know what's going on with everybody. So you can't contract that, hey, I get the kids 75% of the time if we divorce. Well, what if I'm a drug addict? Which
right.
Not. But what if I were?
Or I live in Antarctica or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there could be reasons that is
and
not
the kids live in Texas. Yeah.
Best for the children. So you're not allowed. It's against public policy to do that. It's also against public policy to say that you'll never pay child support, that you won't ever be required to pay child support. So you could put that in your contract, but the court is going to find that aspect of the contract void because it is against public policy. So there are some limitations.
But not very many, and it mostly is you can't violate existing laws that would govern contractual interactions.
Yes. That's true.
Right. All right. So I think that segues us into our next sort of headline item, which is the Postnup agreement. Now, when I first heard this term when I was a kid, I thought it was an agreement you made after you got divorced, but then I realized that doesn't make any sense. So surely it's an agreement you make during your marriage. Yes, am I right there?
Yes. It's a contract that you enter into while you are married to, again, change what the law would do regarding your rights, regarding your property at death or divorce. And it could also have the effect of, and it does have the effect of changing your ownership interest in your property while you are married.
Okay. It can, or it
does.
That is, it can if you want to, or it always does.
Well, that's a good question. I would say in most cases it does.
Okay. And could you go a little, or perhaps let me ask another question. So, are there any differences in what you are able to do in a postnup versus a prenup? Because from what you said earlier, you have a great deal of freedom in how you want to arrange your, for the divorce. Do you have that same level of freedom with a postnup, or are your options more constrained?
It's very similar. And the reason that people do a postnup sometimes instead of a prenup is, one, maybe they got married quickly and they didn't have time to deal with it and they didn't want to. So they ended up doing it in a postnup form. But another reason sometimes people do it, it's almost a way to salvage their relationship if they're having a lot of conflict about money. And perhaps the conflict, as an example, I had a case once where the husband was a big risk taker financially, and he had made millions and lost millions in his business ventures. And that was all great with him. He had a high tolerance for risk, but the wife did not. And she just could not take it. And so she thought she would need to divorce him to get off of this risk roller coaster financially. But instead, they ended up staying married, but entering into a partition agreement, which is what a postnup is, a partition agreement, where they partitioned their existing property and their future property. So they basically said, here's how we're dividing what we own now. You get this item, I get that item, and my future earnings and deals are mine and debts, and your future earnings and deals and debts are yours. And she felt good about that because she could control the portion she got and the future of that portion. And he could not put that portion at risk. Now, she wasn't going to get the upside either, right? So the next time he hit it big, that's
It's his money.
Unless he wanted to gift some of it to her, which none of these contracts prohibit people from making gifts if they want to be generous. But that's an example of why somebody might enter into a postnup.
Right. Now, you mentioned in there current property and future property, but can a postnup affect property retroactively? As an example of what I'm thinking of, you gave an example in the prenup section about wanting to keep your 401k intact, and more importantly, so that you wouldn't have to keep all of those records. Could you, in a postnup, say, okay, I didn't keep those records, but we are agreeing between us that when we got married, I had a 401k and it was worth this much, and I put this much into it over this amount of time, and we're just saying now that has always been true retroactively and will be true if we ever get divorced. Is that a thing you can do?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay. So are there any other common reasons why people get postnups, or is that mostly what, in your experience, what is sort of conflict reconciliation?
Yeah, and I think with both prenups and postnups, if they're doing the postnup more like a prenup, they just didn't have time to do it before they got married. I think in both of those instances, another reason that it's common is in second marriages or later in life marriages, when both parties already have children, maybe they have grown children, and the children might be worried about their future inheritance. That would be a common reason to do a prenup or a postnup, to just not have all the children worried about maybe what are people's incentives for marrying their mom or dad. And maybe that's important even to the people getting married, to protect some amount of wealth being passed down to the future generations.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. All right, anything else on postnups before we move on to cohabitation agreements?
I don't think so.
Well, then let us move on to cohabitation agreements. What is a cohabitation agreement?
Okay, so this is the circumstance where you are living with your significant other. It's a romantic relationship. You're living together, but you are not married, but you want to have some agreements about, for example, how you're going to share your expenses, your living expenses, since you're living together. And it's a contract signed by both parties.
Right. And so it sort of covers similar things in a similar scope as prenups and postnups, yes?
No, it's different because you're not accumulating property. You're not accumulating community property because you're not married. So you don't have property together. You don't have to worry about your 401k because there is no property together or growing. It's more about your daily living expenses. So I'm living with Joe Bob, and we're not married, so we're not accumulating a community estate, but each month somebody has to pay the rent on our house, and somebody has to pay the light bill, and who's paying for the groceries. And if I paid for everything one month and you didn't because it just was convenient, do you have to pay me back, or are we splitting these in some way? What if I pay all of them for 2 years and then we break up? Do you owe me money back? So just to eliminate misunderstandings and to have everybody on the same page and have no one feel taken advantage of, sometimes people like to enter into that kind of contract, which is a cohabitation agreement.
Got it. Now, another thing that you mentioned in our pre-conversation was that another important or good reason to get a cohabitation agreement is to something to do with avoiding becoming common law married accidentally. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So in Texas, you can get married formally, where you have a wedding or you have in front of a minister or a judge, and you get a marriage license, but you can also get common law married. And when you're common law married, there's a 3-prong test to be common law married. And the 3-prong test is you live together as a married couple, you agree between yourselves that you are married, and you hold yourself out as married. And holding out, examples of holding out could be social holding out, like introducing as your husband or your wife. More significant holding out would be legal holding out. For example, if you file a joint tax return that says married filing jointly, you're holding yourselves out as married to the government, and there are differences in the way taxes are taxed against people if they're married or single, so that is significant. Another common way of holding out that's legal is filing somebody on your health insurance as your spouse. And that's a reason people want to be married sometimes, is to have those benefits. So when you're common law married, if you are common law married, you are just as married as if you stood in front of a minister or a judge. There is zero difference. You're not kind of married or kind of not married. You're either married or not. But the problem becomes sometimes, because it's not as clear cut as standing in front of a judge or a minister and you signed a marriage license, in the common law marriage area, sometimes people end up having a dispute, which turns into a lawsuit, which we would go try. Are they married or not? We might have to try that before we divorce them, or at death in probate court, we might have to try if they were married or not, because their rights to property are different if they were married to the person, right? That whole thing we were talking about. If you're married to him, you were getting some community property accumulating. So sometimes people want to live together and they do not want to be married, and they don't want any chance of having a dispute and lawsuit about whether or not they were married. And for that purpose, they would enter into a cohabitation agreement, because the cohabitation agreement would say, we are not married. We are living together.
Cohabitating, but not married.
We're cohabitating, because that's one of the prongs of the test. So you know you've already met one of the prongs by living together. It's easy to lie and say, oh, we did agree we're married. Well, one of them says we did and one of them says we didn't, right? And then it's the whole holding out. And sometimes people socially hold out for social pressure reasons. Maybe at church they think it's unwelcome in their church to live with somebody you're not married to, so they call them husband or wife at church when they're not really, and they both agree they're not. They're just doing that for the social reason. Or somebody else refers to, hey, your husband, and they don't correct them because who cares? You know what I mean? So to just be crystal clear, for legal purposes, some people want it to be clear that they're not common law married, and so they like to have this cohabitation agreement. And they will say, if we ever get married, we will either do so formally or we will sign a new agreement, because you can sign a piece of paper that says you're common law married. It's not required to be common law married, but sometimes people do for purposes of proving to the insurance company, in our example of health insurance, they will sign something that says we're common law married.
There you go. Well, that is fascinating. I didn't know any of that. I did not know that it was possible to get married without knowing that you're married.
Accidental marriage. Whew.
That's I'm shocked no one's turned that into a premise for a romantic comedy yet, or maybe they have and I just haven't seen it. Okay, so sort of in brief recap, we've talked about prenups, which is agreements you make before you get married about what is going to happen to your property once you're married and then once you stop being married. We have postnups, which are similar agreements, but you make them while you're married instead of before you're married. And then we have cohabitation agreements, which is sort of a tangential cousin dealing with sort of day in, day out living expenses and arrangements between people who are cohabitating but are not married. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that you've thought of, or that that has inspired you on this topic before we bring it all home?
Yeah, one add-on is, in all of these cases, both parties need to have a separate lawyer. So one lawyer cannot represent both parties in any of these contracts.
Because they're making a contract with each other? Yes,
because they're not aligned. So lawyers have a duty to be an advocate, and they can't advocate two different positions at the same time, so they can only represent one. And there's a lot of case law out there about enforceability of these contracts. They're found to be very enforceable. But one of the things that you need in order to have definite enforceability is a lawyer for both parties, and it's better not to be signing your prenup while you're walking down the aisle. It's better to have a little less pressure on the deal than that, and full disclosure is required. So you have to give full disclosure, both parties, to each other of their financial situation, assets, and debts before they enter into this prenup in order for it to be valid, so that people are contracting away their rights knowingly. They know what they're signing away, because, you don't want somebody later to say, well, I never would have signed that if I known he had blah, or he didn't have blah, or he had these debts, or she had these problems, or these assets. So that's why the law requires that, I think.
Yeah, that makes some sense. We don't want people making contracts based on lies and faulty premises.
But my most important thing for people to know is if you sign it, you are very likely to be held to the contracts you sign. In Texas courts believe in holding people to their contracts. So don't think, oh, I'll just be able to explain later how it wasn't fair. No, do not sign something that you are not committed to, because you are likely to be held to it.
Well, there we go. It's good to know. Okay. Well, I have worked my way through all of my questions. So I think that's all we have for today here at the DFW Divorce Insider Podcast. Thank you so much for being on, Mom. It's great to have you back.
Pleasure.
And thank you so much to everybody out there for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast so that you'll get every episode right when it comes out. If you are interested in learning more about today's topics, you will find some links in the description of this episode leading to some further reading. If you are looking for family law representation in the DFW North Texas area, please look us up at www.duffyandeitzen.com, DuffeeAndEitzen.com, or at dallastxlegal.com. Or you can just type Duffy and Eitzen into Google. That's spelled Duffee and Eitzen. You can also send us email at info@d-elaw.com or give us a call at 214-416-9010. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I've been Matthew Eitzen.
I'm Melinda Eitzen.
And this has been the DFW Divorce Insider Podcast. Y'all take care now.